Welcome to the Toys for Life shop. I've been a Corvette nut for over 15 years. I've owned this C5 for over a decade, and during that entire time period, I've helped countless other C5 owners with maintenance and repairs, and so I'd like to think I've learned a thing or two about these fantastic cars. In addition to that, my C5 has been at over 650 horsepower to the crankshaft for the past 6 years. It's able to achieve 130 miles per hour in the quarter mile, and I'm proud to say that I have done 100% of the modifications, the custom tuning, the repairs, and of course, all of the maintenance. In addition to that, number two, as of right now, which is late 2025, I still believe that the C5 Coupe beats out all 7 other Corvette generations when it comes to offering the most Corvette performance for the money, period. Does that mean I think the C5 is the highest performance Corvette generation ever made? Of course not, but what it does mean is when somebody says, Toys for Life right now, which generation of the Corvette offers the most bang for the buck? Without hesitation, I say the C5. Now, the C5 Z06 does offer a fair bit more performance than the C5 Coupe, but as of the date of this video, the Z06 also costs about $10,000 more as well. And so for the extra performance you get, I think it's just too much money to allow the Z06 to be the best bang for the buck. Now, since there is a C6 sitting here as well, you might be thinking, does the C6 offer more performance over the C5? And if so, is it a better value proposition? I don't think so. Now, it is true that all C6 Corvettes offer more performance than the C5 Coupe, but just like the C5 Z06, they do cost a fair bit more. And in my opinion, the C6s that come the closest to the C5 Coupe in terms of Corvette performance for the dollar would be the LS2 powered cars, but even so, they typically cost at least $5,000 more than the C5 Coupes, and for buyers that are just looking for the most Corvette performance bang for the buck, I don't think they make the cut. So with all of that out of the way, if you're here because you're seriously considering purchasing a C5 Corvette, rest assured you've come to the right place. Grab a cup of coffee and let's get started.
Toys for Life.
The 5th generation C5 Corvette was manufactured for model years 1997 through 2004, and this video is intended for those individuals that are doing their due diligence and trying to become as knowledgeable as possible. If you're watching this video and you already own a C5, please do not be offended if I suggest to a potential buyer that they avoid a particular year or a particular option that you own. All C5s are fantastic cars, none of them are bad. However, I do think there are some years and particular options that are more desirable than others. And if you happen to be a potential buyer trying to get educated and knowledgeable about these cars, I think there are certain things that you want to take into consideration before purchasing your Corvette. One thing that greatly simplifies putting together this 2025 C5 Corvette updated buyer's guide is that there's really only 3 C5 variants to cover. The base coupe has a removable roof panel. Some people call it a target top. I think Porsche might have actually trademarked that name, but at any rate, it's kind of like a convertible. The second variant is the fixed roof coupe, which evolved into the Z06 high performance version in 2001, and that went through 2004. And of course, the convertible. Keeping with the simplicity theme, the C5 Corvette only had 2 engine variants during its 8-year run, the LS1 and the LS6, each of which received rolling updates through the years. Starting in 1997, the first year of the C5 Corvette, the only engine you could get was the groundbreaking LS1. It had 345 horsepower, and for the vast majority of C5 owners, it performed magnificently. Then in 2001, the LS1 received a small bump in horsepower, and Chevrolet was now advertising it as having 350 horsepower, which is not a big deal. However, in addition to that small 5 horsepower bump in power, the LS1 equipped C5s also received 3 other upgrades that, in my opinion, are very much worth mentioning. These 3 upgrades not only increased the LS1's power and durability, they also allowed it to make more power with the same modifications and remain reliable during higher RPMs and sustained high RPM use. The first change was to upgrade the connecting rod bolts used in the LS1. Now, I don't think the GM engineers were trying to fix any sort of a weakness with the LS1 engine. Instead, I think they decided to use the connecting rod bolts that they were designing for the new, for 2001 LS6 engine, more on that in a little bit, which had stronger connecting rod bolts because that engine was going to get a higher red line, as well as it was anticipated that the C5 variant that the LS6 engine was going to go into would also see sustained high RPM use. I want to take just a moment to thank that Chevrolet engineer who must have taken the time to send a memo to the bean counters at GM and convince them to spend the extra buck or two on adding the rod bolts from the LS6 to the LS1 starting in 2001 all the way through 2004. With that seemingly minor change, it made the LS1s that were produced from that point forward that much better at being able to handle the high RPM demands that an LS1 modified with a camshaft or a supercharger absolutely begs for. And it gets even better. Apparently GM was feeling super generous in 2001 because they also decided to give the 2001 and newer LS1 engines the LS6's intake manifold as well, which flows a little bit better, and since that time it has been dyno tested countless times and it is shown to give otherwise stock LS1s a gain of somewhere around 7 to 12 horsepower. Now, you may have noticed that the LS6 intake manifold alone is worth more than the 5 horsepower bump that GM advertised as being the difference between the 2000 and the 2001 LS1 engines. Why is that? I'm not entirely sure, but some speculate that GM deliberately underrated the 2001 and newer LS1s so that the LS6's 385 horsepower in 2001 would seem even more impressive. Whether that's true or not depends on who you ask. The last big change I want to point out is that, again, the 2001 and newer LS1s received a larger mass airflow sensor that not only adds more horsepower right now, it also adds even more horsepower if and when something like a performance camshaft is added in the future. So once again, while the engineers were developing and searching for more horsepower with the LS6, they determined that the 75mm mass airflow sensor that was used on all 97 to 2000 LS1 engines just didn't flow enough air. Instead, the engineers determined that a larger 85mm mass airflow sensor is what was really needed for the LS6, and out of the goodness of GM's heart, they gave the larger mass airflow sensor to all 2001 and newer LS1s as well. Thank you, GM. There were, of course, other rolling changes made to the LS1 through the first few years, but those are the 3 big improvements that I think are most worth talking about. Now let's move on and talk about that new LS6 engine. The LS6 engine was introduced in 2001 as the high-performance engine for the almost brand new C5 Z06. I say almost brand new because in my opinion the Z06 is just further additional refinement to the fixed roof coupe suspension chassis and body that was introduced in 1999. The LS6 engine is not a new clean sheet engine design. Instead, it is more of a refined and upgraded LS1. The LS6 block has larger windows inside the engine near the bottom of the cylinders, which allows for better breathing from bay to bay at high RPMs. This was done to decrease the violence of the air moving inside the engine at high RPMs, which had a tendency to whip up the oil, causing aeration. For 2001, the first year of the LS6, GM rated it at 35 horsepower more than the LS1 for that same year, for a total of 385, which is a pretty big deal. The main ingredients that helped make this possible were improved cylinder heads for the LS6 that offered both higher compression and better flow, as well as a more aggressive camshaft, and together these 2 items made it so that the LS6 pulled all the way up to 6,500 RPMs instead of about 6,000 for the LS1. Of course, the LS6 intake manifold and the larger mass airflow sensor helped as well, but Like I said before, the LS1 received these two upgrades in 2001 as well. For 2002, the LS6 was upgraded again with more changes to the camshaft, to the exhaust, and to the mass airflow sensor that allowed the engineers to wring 20 more horsepower out of the LS6 for a total of 405, and that's damn impressive for a naturally aspirated engine in 2002. Let's switch gears and talk about transmissions. There were three main different transmission options offered in the 5th generation Corvette. About 70% of C5 Corvettes came with the 4-speed 4L60E automatic transmission, which is why it can be challenging to find a used C5 with a manual transmission. The automatic transmissions were all pretty decent, but they did receive rolling changes through the years, which resulted in the later year automatics being somewhat more durable. The second transmission is the T56 6-speed manual transmission offered in all of the C5 variants except for the Z06. The third main transmission is again a T56 6-speed manual, and this time it was modified to be used exclusively in the Z06. It had a host of changes inside, but the most notable changes are the deeper gears in first, second, and third. So which transmission is best for a C5 Corvette? An automatic or a manual? Well, in my opinion, if you intend to use the car as a true sports car and want to get the most out of it, then a 6-speed manual is the only way to go. But if you mainly intend to use the C5 as a daily driver, or if you're stuck in traffic a lot, or if you have a physical limitation that makes it difficult to shift gears, or if you just happen to prefer an automatic, then don't listen to anybody else, including me, and go ahead and buy yourself a C5 with an automatic and don't look back. That having been said, if you buy a C5 with an automatic transmission, most of them came with a 273 rear differential gear ratio, and that makes them very slow from 0 to 30 miles per hour. A small percentage of the C5s with automatic transmissions did come with an optional 315 rear differential gear ratio, and that makes them significantly quicker from 0 to 30 and much more enjoyable in my opinion. So if acceleration is important to you, see if you can find one with that 315 rear differential gear. The easiest way to identify which gears the C5 you're looking at has is to open the glove box door on most C5s and see the list of RPO codes. If there's a code GU2, that means it has 273 gears. If it has the codes GU90 and or GU92, that means it has the 315 gears. And if it has a manual transmission, it probably has the code GU6, and that means you have 342 gears. To finish up the discussion on the C5's drivetrain, there is one more major change that a buyer of a manual transmission C5 might want to be aware of, especially if they plan to add more power. All 2001 C5s received an upgraded torque tube with several improvements that made it quite a bit stronger than the torque tubes that came in manual transmission 97 to 2000 C5s. Oh, and if you're not aware, all C5 Corvettes came with a torque tube, and it's that structural item you see in the center. It bolts the engine and the transmission together, and it also contains the drive shaft inside. So now we've talked about the different body styles, the different engines, and the different transmissions. Now let's talk about an issue that, in my opinion, no legitimate C5 buyer's guide should gloss over. Some call this issue overblown. Some are going to call it beaten to death, and I'm talking about the anti-lock brake system control module, or more technically known as the electronic brake control module, or EBCM for short. C5 Corvettes came with two different generations of EBCMs. The first generation came in the 97 to 2000 cars, and the second generation ran from 2001 through 2004. The EBCM is a very important component. It is necessary for the anti-lock brake system, the traction control system, and if your car came with it, it's also necessary for the active handling system. Neither generation of EBCM is available new or from the aftermarket, and unfortunately, the first generation of the EBCM is typically not repairable if there's an issue. Here's the C5 page from ABS Fixer, which is a well-known company that repairs automotive modules, and as you can see, there are only a few diagnostic trouble codes that they are able to fix inside the first generation EBCM. The second generation EBCM is generally speaking much more repairable, including a fairly common repair that a lot of DIYers have done themselves, which simply entails resoldering a couple of joints on a circuit board. If, however, something more sinister is wrong inside your second generation EBCM, here's a page from ABS Fixer once again. This time it's for their 01 through 04 EBCMs, and as you can see, there are numerous diagnostic trouble codes that they are able to repair, and the price is quite a bit cheaper. Like I already said, some guys say this issue is way overblown. Some even say that the Generation 2 EBCM fails more often than the first generation. I'm not sure where they're getting that data. I don't think anybody knows except for perhaps GM if they happen to be tracking this sort of thing from their service departments back in the day. What I do know for certain is that if you have a C5 with an EBCM issue, you're probably going to be a lot happier if it's an 01 through 04 C5. Oh, and in case you're wondering, regardless of what year C5 you have, I believe you should be able to still drive the car, except you just won't have anti-lock brakes, traction control, or active handling, and you'll have a bunch of lights on in your dash.
All right, so this is new on the way to the track, and we got all these messages. So I don't know what that means, but we'll look it up.
One last thing about the EBCM issue. Apparently one guy did successfully retrofit a Gen 2 PCM into a Gen 1 C5 back in 2016. There's a write-up on Corvette forum, and I've read through it, and there's definitely a lot of enthusiasm about it. That having been said, in the 9 years that have passed since this breakthrough, this upgrade hasn't really caught on much. Perhaps because it's a fairly complex upgrade. It's definitely not plug and play. And so if you or anybody you know has any first-hand experience with attempting this upgrade, I'd love to hear about it, so please leave it in the comments below. Let's talk about C5 brakes for about 15 seconds. All C5s came with the same size rotors and calipers, so that makes it easy because there's really not any brake options to analyze. Suspensions. There were 3 main suspensions that were offered with the C5 Corvette. The FE2 suspension is very soft, very good for daily driving. The FE3 suspension is a bit sportier, so it feels more like a sports car, and it's the suspension that was offered with the infamous Z51 package. And then there's the FE4 suspension, which came with the track-ready Z06. I believe each of the different suspension options came with its own unique shock absorbers, which are all obviously shot by now, their own unique springs, and unique sway bars. And the good news here is the aftermarket in 2025 has a whole bunch of different shock options, sway bar options, and even some different spring options. So no matter which C5 you end up with, you can tailor the ride to your intended use. There was also the F45 and F55 selective ride control systems available, and with the turn of the knob, it either affected the shock's valving or the magnetism, I think, of the shock fluid, and that made the shocks either super stiff for the track or a lot softer for the street. These systems worked very well, but now 20 years later, if you have a shock go bad, and they probably are, good luck trying to find one, and if you do find one, it's probably about $1,000 a piece. So in 2025, most guys simply opt to swap in a set of performance aftermarket shocks, and then they have the dash lights turned off by either using shock simulators or having a skilled technician with a Tech 2 reprogram the body control module. Moving on, there are different options like regular and sport seats, different rim options, heads-up display, things like that, but that's really getting into the weeds, so I wouldn't spend the time right now getting too bogged down on these items. When you're ready and when you finally do start the search for your C5, I want you to ask yourself this question: how important to you are anti-lock brakes, traction control, and active handling? And how much would it bother you if there was always a light on your dash signaling trouble with this system? In my mind, your answer to this question will determine if you are willing to consider all 8 years of the C5 or just the 2001 through 2004s. The next question I want you to think about and ask yourself is, do you have any intentions of modifying your LS engine to increase its horsepower dramatically by installing something like a performance cam or a supercharger? If you answer yes to this question, then I think you really need to opt for the 2001 through 2004 C5s due to those stronger rod bolts, the better mass airflow sensor, and the better intake manifold. The next question I think you should ask yourself is, are you or do you think you might become a serious road racer or a serious autocrosser? And if the answer is yes, you might want to consider buying a Z06 for the extra horsepower and the lighter weight chassis and the better suspension parts right out of the gate. And finally, we all need to be honest with ourselves about the budget part of the equation. If you've been waiting a long time and you really just finally want to get into a C5 so you can start enjoying it, and you're willing to roll the dice about that ABS issue that we talked about, and you don't have any plans for a major bump in horsepower, then by all means consider all 8 years of the C5. You're probably going to be able to find some really good deals in the 97 through 2000 model years. At the end of the day, by arming yourself with as much information as possible about the 5th generation Corvette, you're going to be able to take a look at your list as to what's important to you to have in a C5 and what's less important, as well as your budget, and then you can make informed decisions while shopping for that C5. When you do finally start your hunt, I have some additional tips for you. Right now it's October, and this is probably the best time of the year to buy a C5, especially in the northern part of the country, because there's a lot of sellers out there that are a bit more negotiable in the fall because they don't want to store the C5 for the entire winter. The most important thing to evaluate about a C5 you're looking at for purchase is, what is its condition and how well was it taken care of? Was it pampered or was it beat on? Was it outside a lot in the hot sun or was it stored inside? Were all of the car's maintenance items taken care of on time, or have they been neglected and deferred? And then after those items, then I would start looking at how many miles the C5 has on it. To help you figure these things out, I suggest you watch this video next, which goes through in great detail how to thoroughly evaluate a C5 you're considering for purchase. If this video helped you in any way, please tap that thumbs up below, consider subscribing, and most of all, thanks for watching, and good luck finding your C5.